Today, we continue our study in the prophecy of Daniel, and we have reached chapter 4 for our study today. In this chapter, actually, there are 3 or 4 chapters here in the book of Daniel that are quite different from the others. It happens to have been written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, because they were written not by Daniel, but written by a pagan emperor. We know him as Nebuchadnezzar. This is a story that Nebuchadnezzar wrote, which got into the book of the prophecies of Daniel. And it's concerning a period of Nebuchadnezzar's life in which Daniel prophesied, of course. And our lesson text today deals with the last part of chapter 4, verses 28 to 34. But it will be worth our time, I think, to go back and look at the earlier part of the story in order to capture the whole picture here, as God has inspired a pagan to recognize his sovereignty over all of the creation. Chapter 4 begins with Nebuchadnezzar making a proclamation in which he recognizes the God of Israel as the great God. He gives a blessing in this chapter. He gives a blessing to all the people in the name of God. And then he begins an incredible testimony concerning a dream he had and the process that dream led to. He speaks of the miracles and the greatness of the God of Israel. He speaks of God's eternal kingdom, which will have no end, as well as his absolute dominion over all of creation. He shares what he has. He shares that he was in his house at peace when he had this vision or a vivid dream, which puzzled him greatly. And so naturally he called in the magicians and the soothsayers, which was the normal reaction that a pagan king would have at that time. This is the band of those who claim to have contact with the secret understanding of life. And he recognized that there are higher powers. These powers are in heaven. But he's become convinced now that the God of Israel is the supreme God. There's no evidence that Nebuchadnezzar ever denied other spiritual beings, but he has decided that the God of Israel is the supreme being of all the universe. And as he called in the wise men and the soothsayers, he shared his vision with them, but no one dared interpret his vision or his dream. Maybe it was too obvious to them, because it is fairly obvious. So then he called in the chief magi. This happened to be Daniel at this time, because Daniel had been moved to the number 1 spot among the magi. At this juncture, we hear the dream or the vision. He dreamt of a very tall tree, visible from the whole earth. It was filled with life of all kinds. It provided food, provided shelter for creatures, with a boundless generosity. It was a veritable tree of life. When suddenly a divine watcher came from heaven and ordered that the tree be chopped down, and scattered all of its leaves, its branches, and its fruit, destroying everything, leaving only the stump with bands of brass and iron to preserve the stump alive. Now, at this juncture in the story, the vocabulary changes. Suddenly, we no longer are talking about a tree, but rather Nebuchadnezzar becomes the center of attention. And he is told that a human mind would be removed from a man and replaced with an animal mind, and that he would eat grass and live outside in the elements. And this would last through 7 seasons or 7 periods of time. And this was commanded by the watchers, the holy ones. Now they're plural. It's not just the one who ordered the tree chopped down. Now they are plural. The term watchers was used by the Babylonians to refer apparently to what the Hebrews call the angels. They were messengers from the gods. Now, they were commanding this, according to Nebuchadnezzar, so that everyone would know that God Most High rules in the kingdoms of earth and determines earthly rulers. When Daniel heard all of this, he was stunned. The message was too clear to him. And perhaps that's why he said to Nebuchadnezzar that it would be better that this dream had come to his enemies rather than to him. But because of the many years of confidence between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, the king ordered him to tell him the whole truth, leave nothing out. And so Daniel did. He said, King, you are the tree. And this catastrophe is going to happen to you unless you change your way of life. Perhaps, he says, perhaps, if you change and repent, God will also change his mind about this. But apparently Nebuchadnezzar had no intention of, at that point, repenting in any sense of the word. So a year later, the king is admiring his kingdom and allowing his pride to just overwhelm him to the point that he started talking to himself about his greatness. And that's where we pick up our narrative today in our lesson for this week. And our first verses, I'll read 28 through 30, because here King Nebuchadnezzar is writing, and he says, all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, as he was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon, the king exclaimed, is this not Babylon the Great that I have built to be a royal residence by my vast power and for my majesty and my glory? Now, those are the words that Nebuchadnezzar said that he was saying out loud to himself. Now we know from history as well as from the scriptures that Nebuchadnezzar was a frightfully cruel and arrogant and pride-filled person. He also had a very, very short temper. He sort of considered the known world as his private playhouse. So we can picture him walking along the palace wall over the Euphrates, beholding the beauty of this city that had been built, and thinking that it was all because of his greatness. And he considered himself as all-powerful. He considered himself as truly glorious, very near considering himself a god. He was a ruler whose pride rose to the attention of heaven. Suddenly, the words of the watchers were heard again, this time directly from heaven. And these are verses 31 through 33 of Daniel chapter 4. Now I'll read those. While the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice from heaven came, saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared that the kingdom has departed from you. You will be driven away from the people to live with the wild animals, and you will feed on grass like cattle for 7 periods of time, until you acknowledge that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms, and he gives them to anyone he wants. At that moment, the message against Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people, he ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with dew from the sky, until his hair grew like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. So we see here now that it is as if God had seen and heard more than enough from Nebuchadnezzar. Because it says, while Nebuchadnezzar was still speaking, he was interrupted by a voice from heaven which yelled, enough! It's over. You will be driven out from to the pastures and to the forest. You'll be like an animal until you recognize that it is God who rules the affairs of men. And it is God who determines who will rule. Until you recognize that he put you at the top of the world, and he has turned you out to pasture. It happened suddenly. He was driven out immediately. Apparently, he showed evidence of absolute madness and was driven away. So his hair grew long and his nails grew long, and he was acting like an animal during these 7 periods or 7 seasons. We don't know if they were years or half years, because the Babylonians divided their years into 2 periods or 2 seasons, summer and winter. But finally his chastisement was up, and he came to himself. Our last verses today introduce us to a different man. He has been humbled by God, humbled by the very God of heaven, and he recognized that reality. Now, our last verses are really fantastic kind of part of his testimony here as he's writing this, and I'll read those last verses 34 through 37. But at the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity returned to me. Then I praised the Most High, and honored and glorified him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does what he wants with the army of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can block his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At that time, my sanity returned to me, and my majesty and splendor returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and my nobles sought me out. I was reestablished over my kingdom, and even more greatness came to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heavens, because all his works are true, and his ways are just. He is able to humble those who walk in pride. Now that's quite a different fella from the one who was walking on the walls of the city. After these 7 periods of time, Nebuchadnezzar, of course, has changed his total view. Now he had looked he had his eyes on earth before, and now he has his eyes at least partially on heaven. And when that happens, sanity does return. That's some pure revelation here. First thing he did was to honor and glorify God, who is alive forever, and whose rule over his world never, ever ends. He recognizes that whatever puny efforts man makes to determine the direction of destiny are really nothing to God. God's purposes will be accomplished. God controls an army of angels in heaven. He also controls the movement of people on earth. We do not dare ask, "What are you doing?" as Nebuchadnezzar says, as if to be indignant or rebellious about what God is doing with his creation. And when these lessons are learned, sanity returns so that a person may fulfill his or her purpose under God's power. Rulers must recognize and praise the God, the King of heaven and the King of earth, certain that whatever God says and does is true and just. And the person who can do that no longer walks in pride, but knows that God can and does humble the proud. Now, from the prophets of the Old Testament, we see many eternal truths which God revealed. And the fact is that if they were truth then they are truth now. Because God himself said, "I do not change like man does." I've listed 8 articles of truth that we may glean from this section of Scripture from Daniel. Number 1, God knows everything going on earth. There are absolutely no secrets from God. Number 2, God knows everything going on in my head. God knows what we are doing as individuals. Remember, Jesus said, "Even the hairs on your head are numbered." So if God is so meticulous that he numbers the hairs on our heads, you know he knows what's going on inside them. Number 3, everyone is tempted by the sin of pride. It's a terrible kind of thing. And it, of course, is the major sin from the Scriptures. Pride basically says, "I am smarter than God." That's a very big mistake. It started early. It started in the Garden of Eden when Satan tried to convince Adam and Eve that he was smarter than God, and then Eve decided that she was smarter than God. And so from the very beginning of human existence, this pride element of deciding that we can handle it on our own has been a big temptation for humankind. Number 4, God has absolute control of the universe. He actually spoke it into existence. And he said that he will speak it out of existence in the precise time. Number 5, God determines the rise and the fall of nations. Now that's hard for us to believe when we see wars being fought and we see all the political intrigue that takes place. We get the idea that what we are doing is determining the future or the destiny of nations. But God says no. God determines the rise and the fall of nations. Number 6, He determines who is to rule the nations and for how long. God says, I make kings, I put them on the throne, and I take them off. God determines who is to rule, regardless of what we may think about our activity. It is God's decision in the end. Number 7, God is worthy of all honor and praise. Now, we did not decide that. We did not decide to honor God and to praise Him. God did. God proclaimed that He is worthy of honor and praise. And so He is worthy of all honor and praise. He is God. We sometimes try to take our personalities and apply our way of thinking to God. God says, my thoughts are high above your thoughts. And He is worthy. And He is worthy of honor and praise. And He decided it. And He proclaimed it. Number 8, God gives honor and power to whom He will. Now, we sometimes have difficulty believing that God is really sovereign and He has sovereign control of all that is occurring in our world. But without that firm conviction, life can become very difficult. But with that firm conviction that God is in control, we can face our adversities and our joys with a different attitude. Somehow, we must have confidence that God is working out His purpose in every circumstance of life, and that it eventually is going to bring Him glory and honor. After all, He manipulates history because it is His story. Excuse me. I'd like to read one more verse. Romans 8:28 is a favorite verse of a lot of people, but it also reflects something of this lesson. And Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose." So in order to avoid serious discipline, like Nebuchadnezzar's, we need to avoid personal pride. We need to avoid a pride that leads to disobedience. And so we need to obey the rules for living that God Himself has given us. Let's thank Him. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for the lessons You teach us, and give us wisdom, Lord, to be obedient, that we may walk in paths of righteousness for Your name's sake. Amen.